the idea of being able to shape how you're seen is a matter of human survival in a lot of ways. To be interpreted and understood in the way that we want to be understood isn't an exercise of vanity. It's an exercise in building trust by being authentically who we are and taking things that are often framed up maybe as a weakness and instead understanding that might just be who we are and that is actually a strength. It just might be our own way. To your point, that there's more than one way to lead and influence and be inspiring.
Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to unraveling the journey of being authentic in the workplace. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and this is another episode in our Career Questions series. Today, we're going to be talking about personal branding, what it really is, how you can develop yours, and why it's important to your career, both from a success standpoint, but more importantly, for your own well-being. And to tackle this topic, I'm bringing on a friend and fellow solopreneur and consultant, Cat Coffrin. Cat is the founder of Captivating Consulting, and she's a brand strategist who helps companies and also corporate women find the language to describe themselves more clearly and to communicate their value. A lot of the work that Cat and I do overlaps in a really cool way, and we're going to be touching on this throughout the episode. And while we're talking today about personal branding, this episode is not about just creating a persona that sounds good or is appealing to a company. What we're really talking about is achieving this really strong and really clear sense of self, having a deep understanding of who you are and putting words to it. This understanding of ourselves often comes from personal or internal exploration. But if it were that easy, if we just had to do some self-reflection and get clear, I think we would all be doing it. So instead of just jumping into how to cultivate your personal brand, where we're actually going to begin the conversation is with what is happening right now in the world and in the workplace that makes it so hard for us to know ourselves. And after that, we'll talk a bit more about how each of us go about doing this internal exploration with our clients and finding the insights about ourselves that aren't always apparent to us. And then what to go do with that information once you've gotten clear on who you are and the unique value that you bring to the world and the workplace, and then how to articulate that to others. So grab a notebook because I think you're going to want to take some notes, and let's dive into this conversation with Cat. All right, Cat, welcome to Working Your Way. I am super excited to have you on today, and we're going to talk about all things personal branding. But what we're really going to talk about is how we can better know ourselves and be connected to ourselves and align our careers with the things we love.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad to be here. This is one topic that I absolutely love. I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about, and something that I feel like represents an area of overlap between the work that you do and the work that I do. This conversation feels like a long time coming, and also especially timely at this moment in time.
Yeah, so let's talk about this moment in time. I want to get into your career journey a little bit, but what are you seeing and hearing and feeling out there in the world? Because I feel like there are a lot of amazing people who are feeling this sense of, I don't even know who I am or what I care about or what I do well.
The phrase that comes to mind when you ask that question is identity crisis. I feel like it's all around us. And in a lot of cases, maybe it's no mistake that I left corporate America and I started my own business a little bit over 4 years ago. It was February 3rd of 2020 was the first day of Captivating Consulting. Unwittingly, about 6 weeks before, I found myself standing in the laundry room, avoiding my children during homeschooling to have a cry. And so that was the context into which I launched this business, which in the beginning was really just going to be about corporate brand strategy. But for me, my own experience of leaving a company I'd been at for a decade, where I'd really grown up at a lot, not to mention the 5 or so years that I'd had in the professional world before that, and then going out on my own, was such a startling experience of discovering that so many years of playing the game, climbing the ladder, doing everything right, working so hard, traveling, juggling motherhood and working and relationships and everything that I had going on in my life, all of this achievement I had racked up, following the path that I thought I was told I should be following, pursuing the things I was told that I should want had actually left me feeling less sure of who I was and what I actually wanted. And then you add into that, of course, the pandemic, and all of a sudden, all of us going through this massive kind of cultural experience together. What did they say? We're in the same storm, but we're on different boats or whatever. It was such a strange shift for how a lot of us think about who we are and our own identity. And it's no surprise, perhaps, that we started to come through that process right at the time my business was getting started, where people were starting to, it became harder to avoid the big, hairy questions because we had a lot more quiet time with ourselves. And that's when you start to realize how much in the corporate working world we use packed schedules and that humble brag, the busyness that we value as a society and a culture, especially in the workplace, to helpfully avoid the really big questions that are very hard to answer about who we are, what we stand for, and what matters to us. So suddenly when the world quiets down a little bit around you, you can't avoid those questions anymore. And I think that was the beginning of what feels like this mounting identity crisis phenomenon that 4.5 years later feels like it's still unfolding. Is that something you hear a lot in your work? Do people come to you with the identity crisis?
Yes. And it's funny because I don't know that it's always named or articulated as that, but it feels just hazy or foggy, or I feel a little lost kind of a thing. And so I got this beautiful testimonial from a client I just finished working with. Some of the things that she articulated were like, for the first time ever, I started to question my, like, thinking about who I am just for me and not for the value that it brings to my organization or the role that it plays. And what I heard in your laundry room story, and so much of this resonates with me in my own personal story, is when you have a keen social awareness, you know what's expected of you. And that almost just becomes the direction you point your compass in. When I can just take in what success looks like, how it's defined by my family or my culture or society or whatever it is, or the internet, it's so easy to say that is what success is. Let me just point my compass in that direction and go. And so many of us are good at going and doing and making things happen. We're not really stopping to redirect that compass toward, is this my direction? Is this my definition of success? Is this what I actually even care about? I'm good at it. I can do it. But like, does that mean that that's right for me?
That's exactly what I'm seeing in my work. And I do think there's a safety in momentum and forward motion. And we tend to give people a hard time, especially earlier in their career and as they're in those really important early growth years, moving into management for the first time, beginning to be responsible for other people, getting those promotions, working towards them. We give people a hard time if they pause, or if they start to go slowly, or if they opt out, or if they do anything that's outside the norm of a prescribed path. And I do think that's one of the biggest things that I've seen shifting in the past couple of years is this. You can see on LinkedIn more and more people are putting things like intentional sabbatical or a year off in their work history, even other parts of their identity, like being a mother or a father or anything else that you might do, a caregiver, is starting to show up. And we're starting to expand that idea of what a professional identity is, but it's happening pretty slowly. And the other comments you were making really made me think of this idea of conflation, right? And a lot of us know that it's happening. Your personal life and your personal identity and all of the factors that you use to identify who you are and define yourself, that you started to mention, your culture, your family, your values, your interests, do start to give way as you rise up the corporate ladder to your corporate identity. And if you think of another interesting trend that I'm curious about how you see this play out in your work, I think we've talked about this before, but the strong corporate culture and the purpose-oriented corporate trends, on the one hand, have been really exciting and interesting, right? I feel like when Simon Sinek first came on the scene, everyone was like so excited about the why and the circles and the golden circles. And I still find so much wisdom in that exercise and that mindset. But as with many interesting, helpful trends in corporate America, I think we've almost overblown it to the point where you think about some of these companies that have super strong corporate cultures, it's very easy to tip into cult of personality. And I remember at companies I've worked with in the past, there would be this almost coded phrase. You might interview someone and say, she's got a great skill set and she's very impressive, but I don't know if she's a culture fit. And you have to pause and say, is that helping what we're trying to achieve with diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example? Is this culture fit really just a coded way to say, I don't know if she's really going to fit in at what we're trying to represent? And then you start to move quickly from there to telling people, these are our corporate values. This is what we stand for. This is your identity. We want you to speak in the language of our company. And there's a lot less room for individuality. So it totally makes sense to me when I look back at things I've experienced at the purpose trend, at corporate culture, and this growing emphasis on culture that did not exist 20 plus years ago in the corporate workspace. Of course, we're having an identity crisis. It's like a perfect storm, right?
It really is. And I think you said this is there's, I think, a lot of good. There's a lot of benefit in having a sense of purpose in your work, in having a strong company culture. But where that goes wrong is there's this old kind of consulting trope in like interviews for like management consultants that travel Monday through Thursday, or they're staying in hotels during the week. And there was this like airport test where when someone's hiring somebody to say, if you got delayed or stuck at the airport, would you want to have a beer with this person? And that is so harmful because it gives us permission to say, I like this person, therefore they're a good fit with the culture. And it eliminates so much of the opportunity to have different ways of thinking. I'm getting like emotionally worked up just talking about this, like thinking and speaking and the way we feel and the places we come from, that like when we want to be with people just like us, like we're diminishing the opportunity or eliminating the opportunity to have true diversity of thought and lived experience in the work. And when it comes to purpose, I will say, because a lot of the work that I do is about motivation. It's about internal motivation, intrinsic motivation, and what do you really care about in your values. And even through the Enneagram work that we'll talk a little bit about later, it's like, what's the core motivation, the core human need that you're really leaning into? And so I strongly believe that having a tie to the sense of purpose in the work that we do is important to have emotionally fulfilling work, that we don't drain ourselves, that we're getting something back, we're getting fulfillment from the work that we do. That's where I see tying to the why. But when it's tying to the why to the extent that this job is what I am and it's who I am, and it's not just what I do, but it's so intrinsically tied to my identity, that's where we get into you get laid off and you have no idea who you are, or you spend all day and night thinking about your job and you can't find that separation, or something changes and then we have that identity crisis, right? Because all we've identified with is this role that we have at this company and this type of work that we do, or those kinds of things.
It makes you realize just how much we are told and shown and encouraged to fall in line and to conform, and how the corporate world just doesn't feel like it's been designed for individuality. And yet here we find ourselves with this kind of dual reckoning of the purpose-driven business, where, to your point, there's a difference between the personal animating driving force or factor that makes something fulfilling for you, which really is just for you and is probably grounded in how you were raised and historically who you've been and where you come from, versus the corporate why that a company grapples with. And I help work in both of those spaces. So I think about them a lot. And it's great when there's a connection, but they should not be one and the same, because that is like the ultimate level of identity conflation. And once that happens, you make space for your story about management consulting companies saying, as a factor in interviewing process, could you see yourself having a beer with this person on a layover or a flight delay? It's such a blatant example of identity politics at work, right? Because that's what we always say about presidential candidates. And so when we start to move into that sea of sameness, that's, to me, the ultimate reflection of that idea of conformity as a value. And of course, it makes it really hard then to actually say, can somebody show up then moving into your spaces authentically in the workplace as they are and still succeed by being who they are? Or do they need to mask that? And obviously, I think about this question a lot because it comes up a lot in the work that I do. How vulnerable, how open should we really be about where we come from? Are we supposed to be telling people when we need to leave work early because of some really deeply personal thing that's going on? Is it okay and acceptable to find some kind of middle ground to talk about that? Or should we mask it completely as we historically have done? And I think there's a real reckoning here that's happening right now of everyone trying to figure out how to answer those questions in a way that makes sense for all of us, even while we're still trying to figure out if hybrid work or remote work can even be conducive to corporate culture. So all of these like individual battles, identity battles, are happening at the same time that we're even unsure about whether we can still work the way that we've been working or if that's going to be tenable going forward. And so then you take all of that and you set that aside and say, where's the human person here? And how can we really actually help that person? At the end of the day, the most simplistic version, setting aside all of the complexities that we've just talked about, is we start out knowing who we are as children. We start out being encouraged to explore our individuality. And then as we even start to go up into elementary school, we start to be told to be a little bit less of ourselves. And I think that's the beginning. I have an almost 10-year-old daughter, and I've been watching her as she's grown. And it's been just around 9 into 10 years old where I've started to see her be individual, but also we need you to fit in a little bit more. And how do we encourage these girls, these kids who are growing up to walk that line at the same time of be who you are, but be easier to manage in a crowd? And I think about everything you and I are talking about in our work that we do. And those are the same questions we're grappling with when we get older. And so it's almost like everything's conspiring against us as we get older from that point in elementary school, all the way through the point where you and I are working with people mid to late career, very accomplished, very successful by many measures. And they're shocked to find that they're still grappling with some of those mixed messages that they first started to experience when they were young.
Yes. Oh my gosh. The masking part, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this before we talk about our career stories, because it's these societal messages, it's be polite and all these things, right? Like how we're supposed to be or how we're socialized as female or female identifying and just fitting into this conformity. I like to draw the distinction of like conformity versus assimilation, because anytime we are in any system, we have to assimilate to some extent. I walk outside, I wear clothes. Like, like, is that who I am really, truly? No.
You may not want to.
But I do. If I work in a company, I follow certain norms, right? And those types of things, that's part of assimilating to a culture. But where we get into the danger of conformity is even from a systemic standpoint of there's all the things that come around identity, and there's the Crown Act that's ending hair discrimination at work. You cannot discriminate against somebody for the way their hair naturally grows out of their head. That should be a given. And then there's how do you think? How do you communicate? What's your process in solving problems? And what does a leader look like in our company? What are our leadership competencies? Is there a certain, this kind of je ne sais quoi, this presence that we evaluate leaders against that's largely informed by ways of being that have traditionally been white, male, straight, upper class, all these things. So we're measuring people against a system or a framework that already is not equitable, but we're telling ourselves and companies that it's an objective measure. So everybody knows these things and they should live up to these things, but it's not. It's a biased measure that we're measuring people against.
That is so interesting though, because I hadn't really thought about that, but what I'm hearing and what you're saying is there is even, I bet one area that our work overlaps is I do help companies with corporate values. From time to time, even as part of a strategic planning process or even a corporate branding process, we take a look at values. We might need to update them. It might even be a team's core values for that, how that team is going to build off of what the company stands for. And it is really interesting to say, where does this edge into social contract, which is more, in my view, of how I'm going to respect and what I'm going to promise to the people around me. So the values that I love in those discussions are when you have leaders sitting around saying, even when things get hard, even when we disagree, even when we're facing layoffs, in the toughest situations we know we're going to go through, we've been through, we are always going to agree that we're going to come at each other with the benefit of a doubt. That to me is a social contract. Like to your point, I'm going to expect if you're my neighbor, when you walk outside, you're wearing clothes. That's part of our social contract Right. But you could say the same thing with some of these efforts to define a culture and to define how we're like it's. So if a company says resilience and optimism are our core values, does that mean that somebody who's a worrier cannot succeed here?
Right.
And then does that mean that we're telling them that they can't worry and they have to change who they are? And I get really cagey anytime somebody is being told that they have to be different than they are. Yes. Versus a very healthy, I'm going to ask you, Kat, to always approach Sandhya with a benefit of a doubt. That feels more on the productive side of social contracting.
Yes, I totally agree. And this idea of like optimism as an example, I think we like to tie ourselves in companies really, but individuals to like kind of shiny words. Optimism, what if you are someone who is a contrarian thinker? What if you are someone who sees the risks in things? What if you are someone who is a scenario planner and a preparer and a worrier and a risk mitigator? You actually need those people. So now when you're saying falsely, you just have to be like, look on the bright side all the time. Is that actually helpful? Is that good for a company to always be optimistic? Or what you're really trying to say by having an optimistic culture is being maybe solutions oriented? Like, where is the word or the thing or the framing of the concept that allows people to get there in their own way? Leadership potential, as an example, maybe we can objectively say a leader needs to be inspiring and be able to influence people. But when we say a leader needs to be able to be inspiring and influence people by communicating XYZ ways, that's where it gets into the conformity piece and goes away from there are lots of ways to be inspiring and influencing people. Find your way to do that. That's what we're going to measure you against, not you need to be the fastest voice and the loudest voice in the room. And that's what we consider inspiring or influential. So I'm going on a tangent now.
I know, but I think this is where it connects though, don't you think? Because I think I actually haven't really explored this area of connection as deeply as we are right now, but I've seen it and I've been aware of it and I've thought a little bit about it. And I do think this is where it gets into the personal branding at work and why it matters.
We've been talking about what Kat and I are seeing out there in the workplace and what we're hearing from the leaders that we work with. And transparently, this may not be what you came to this episode for, but it was so important for us to discuss this and share it. Kat and I really wanted to articulate what we are up against when it comes to the systems that we work in, so that we can recognize when we are not the problem and find a way to navigate what we're currently dealing with. And ideally, when we can get into those positions of power, we can leverage our power to change some of these systems. And of course, we may all have had a boss who wasn't great or drove us a little crazy or asked us to do things that didn't feel authentic to us. But the greater challenge lies in our workplace systems. This is a huge part of why it is so hard to be our authentic selves in companies. We talked about how some of the systems in our workplaces are creating or contributing to this problem of making authenticity challenging and taking us further and further away from our true selves. Things like how we're evaluated and the decision-making criteria on who gets promoted or hired, or how leadership potential is determined, or how we're required to conform to certain ways of being because they're deemed part of the company culture and norms, or having company values that are inherently not inclusive and expecting everyone to be a certain way to, quote unquote, align with the values. The biggest barriers to us really owning and embracing our authenticity and being able to articulate our personal brand, the barriers lie in the things that we excuse or write off as acceptable. These things can often be hard to see because we're so used to companies operating in these ways. But just because we've grown familiar with them doesn't mean that they're okay. So now that we talked about what we're seeing in the workplace and the reason that it's critical for us all to be doing this deeper work, really so that we can recognize when we're being asked to be inauthentic or to conform to certain ways of showing up, let's get into what personal branding really is and how to explore ourselves in order to articulate what ours is.
One of the things that I loathe about personal branding is the phrase personal branding.
Yeah.
It seems to convey all sorts of things that I don't think are at all relevant to what you and I are talking about here, which is so much more about adapting systems to support people to be who they are, and also at the same time encouraging the individuals to maintain that space, to have the support that they need to constantly be connecting with who they really are, because we will all be better for it if both systemically it's going to support them, and also if they have the individual support that they need to do that work. Because I often think of the work that I do like the phrasing you use in yoga, right? Which is it's a yoga practice. Mm-hmm. It's intentionally never meant to be perfect. It's about committing to the practice. And when I think about personal branding, it sounds all wrong, because that's not really the way to talk about a personal brand, which is a thing. And a lot of people think of it as, I'm going to go be Kim Kardashian, or I'm going to become an influencer, or I'm going to mold an identity out of thin air. And that's where another crisis can come from in this process. And I think one of the reasons that pretty much to a person, every senior, experienced, accomplished executive I work with in this space says at some point to me, I really don't want to do this work. It makes me really uncomfortable. I don't like talking about myself. And to every single person I say, welcome to the club. I'm so glad you're so humble, but you do deserve to both have the self-awareness of who you are, why you are the way you are, what drives you, what your style is, and what people value in you. And also the language to be able to convey that to other people so that they can better understand you. The idea of being able to shape how you're seen is a matter of human survival in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. To be interpreted and understood in the way that we want to be understood isn't an exercise of vanity. It's an exercise in building trust by being authentically who we are and taking things that are often framed up maybe as a weakness, and instead understanding that might just be who we are, and that is actually a strength. It just might be our own way. To your point, that there's more than one way to lead and influence and be inspiring. So it's okay to set that forth as goals for leaders, but allow some space within that for people to meet you there and say, okay, my form of inspiration and influence is going to be quiet. It's going to be steady. And that's because that's the way that I am. And if you give me space to know that about myself, maybe to even share it with other people and to own that, I'm going to feel more confident. I'm going to feel more seen, and I'm going to be far more successful in my effort to support the company in the leadership style they're looking for.
I love that. It's this idea of like, when we have the space to explore who we are, how we came to be this way, and even where we want to go, because that the practice of leadership in particular is one of growing and evolving. It allows us to stand firm or grow like deeper roots in the way that we are, and to make those decisions when someone's asking us to be something else that's going to lead us down a path toward burnout or inauthenticity, or like you said, showing up inconsistently, which is the worst thing you can do as a leader for your team to build a foundation of trust and psychological safety and all of those things. I also, it's funny because I think personal branding is a hot topic right now because it sounds really cool. And what we're talking about today is not creating a beautiful veneer that sounds good. We're talking about getting really deep and knowing what it is that you bring to the table by not even trying. The things that are so easy to you that sometimes you don't see them yourselves, but all the people around you see them, and naming those things and standing firm in those things and saying, you're asking me to do this, I'm going to do it this way, and I'm going to get to the same result or outcome of success, but I'm going to do it my way. And thus is the premise of this podcast, right? So I would love to hear a little bit about, how did you find your way into this work? Give me the highlights of your career journey. And I don't mean highlights in like just the nice stuff, but the stuff that really resonates with you.
You know that I'm a context person. About a big part of the work that I do and the work you do is about context. So I will try to stay high level, even if it's not highlights. So I never set out to do marketing, but what I always was interested in was the idea of thought leadership and connecting intellectual concepts with emotional inspiring, motivational context and language. And in the beginning, I was doing that with companies primarily in the B2B spaces, a lot of healthcare companies. I joined a marketing firm that was about 1 year old, and I stayed there until they were 11. So I had a chance. That's really where I grew up professionally, to build my career there. And over time, found my way into the brand strategy division. And it made sense for me because it was such a combination of market research and data and strategy. And then beginning to edge into what I think of as downstream marketing, giving the brand identity language and a feel and a persona. And then I would hand it off to my in-house marketing team people who would help us bring that to life across paid, owned, and earned channels. And a lot of the work that I was doing, going back to our conversation about purpose, we were a B Corp. A lot of our focus was working with purpose-driven companies. So it was interesting to me at the time when purpose was still very much an emerging corporate conversation. You could take almost any corporate challenge that a client was facing, whether it was just, we need to build a strategic plan, we don't know where we're most competitive, or we need to revisit our brand identity and our corporate brand strategy, always working at the highest level of how do we explain who we are and why the world needs us to exist. And always approaching that through a lens of bringing together data and research to underscore some kind of core insight or guiding insight that could then bleed into a brand strategy. And my favorite part was always finding the language to bring that to life, to make it really feel like something people connect with intellectually and emotionally. So that was a lot of the work that I was doing there. When I struck out on my own at the very outset of 2020, just before the pandemic, what I was really moving towards was this idea to keep doing that. And what's interesting, and I don't know if I've shared this with you, but a very pivotal moment for me in that journey was we did strength finder testing at my company. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of my top 5 strengths was arranger. And I didn't really know what that meant. I also remember my very top strength was activator. And my second strength was strategy. And here I was leading the strategy division. And most of the people on my team were strategy first. And I had such a bias toward action. And I had never really seen that in harsh relief. It was something I knew intuitively by being me. And I'm sure if you asked anybody I worked with, I was very impatient. And sometimes that worked well, right? I'd get an idea and I'd be like, let's go out with this immediately today. The whole world needs to know about our idea. And everyone's, let's slow down. Let's get all the pieces into place. There's no rush. And I'm like, there is a rush. Everything felt like a rush to me. And I remember having a call with a coach to go over my results. And the coach asked me a question that I still use all the time in my personal brand work. And he said, talk to me about your best day at work, like just in general. What are you doing when you get home and you have more energy because you worked, right? Not less. And I was at a pivotal moment in my career that I think a lot of people, especially women, get to around mid-career, where I wasn't sure if I was going to continue up in management towards a CEO role, or whether I wanted to be a sole practitioner or individual contributor, to use corporate speak. And I thought that I should go up the management route because that's where the glory is. And also because I think if you are good with people, you're pushed into management. But when I talked to this coach about my favorite day, it had nothing to do with people. And I love people, right? Like I could chat up a wall. I would be like, wall, where were you born? How has that shaped you? I'm so interested in people that come across me all the time. But what was so interesting in that moment was to finally allow myself to have and then own and internalize and then speak the insights that my best and favorite moments at work are when I can sit down with a bunch of information, be alone, maybe put on some music, do some writing and create. And I'm much more creative than I think I'd ever really allowed myself to own in my career. And that was the moment that I thought, maybe I am unhappy at work because I'm giving all of my good energy emotionally and intellectually to management. And because I've been mistaking the fact that I like people for thinking that I enjoy managing people, and I did not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so freeing to let that go. Right. And I work with so many people now who actually do love management. And I'm always saying to them, do not underestimate how important it is that you actually get energy from this, because the world needs people who want to do these things. Right. And if you don't want to do them, that's okay also to acknowledge them, because you're probably not being your best self. But going back to, I know I'm going a little bit off track here, but going back to our conversation maybe 10 minutes ago, this is where I think we're actually causing damage and getting less out of our people. We're saying to them, if you're a high performer, you have to be a manager. They're not being authentic to their strengths. Let me finish my story. Okay. So that was a big moment for me. It set me on the path of realizing that I did want to work for myself. And it took me some time to come face to face with that. And then I finally started on my own. And the experience after having been at that one company for 10 years of leaving, even though I was going to be doing the same kind of work, corporate brand strategy, as I had been doing for 10 years on my own, I felt like I had everything I need. I had a great network. I had honed my craft. I felt really confident in my ability to define and sell and deliver this work. And yet the process of going out on my own, what I found was that a great network did not necessarily translate into an active support network when I was getting started. And a lot of people that I knew really only knew me in the context of that job. And I'd given so much of my identity over to that company, partly because they'd asked, but really partly because I think that's just the way that we're taught to be. I did it quite willingly over so many years that people would say, so I'm not really sure what you have to offer when you're not there. Who are you when it's just you and when you're on your own? And that process was so uncomfortable and so shocking and isolating that I realized that I needed to define my own brand. I was grappling with the same questions that companies grappled with. Who do I want to serve? Why does the world need me to exist? What do I have to offer? What is it? What's my style? What's going to set me apart? And I took my brand strategy frameworks that we had always used for companies, and I just take the same principles and applied them to myself, and I branded myself, and it helped my business grow. But one of the most important things that it did is it allowed me to be more intentional with what I was saying out into the universe. And it also made a dramatic impact on attracting the right clients, the most interesting opportunities, the most incredible potential partners in my direction. And this sounds a little cheesy, but I almost felt like I was meeting the universe halfway. Like I was doing the work to define myself and to own who I am. And then the universe will say, oh, well, that's interesting. Have you thought about this? But everyone's always trying to figure out all the answers. You just need to do the first half of the work and then put it out there and then let people respond to you. So that was when I got started. I decided to expand my offering to brand strategy for companies, but also for leaders. And then bringing us back to where we started our conversation, COVID hit and the personal branding work just took off. And that's what brought me here.
There's always a little bit of like, I had to do this for myself. And that contributed to how I'm running my business today or where I focus. And honestly, I think those are the best entrepreneur and consultant origin stories because it is deeply personal and we have so much lived experience in doing it for ourselves and how we did it and all those things. I really appreciate that and that journey. For me, and I talked about this in the first episode of this podcast and in my own story, and I've talked about it throughout, but I was really chasing that definition of success that I had internalized from outside of myself. And not to say that I was like deeply unhappy and just a robot climbing the corporate ladder, because that was not the case at all. I actually made some of my very best lifelong friends working for a big corporation and doing the work that I was doing. And there were definitely elements of it that I enjoyed, but it wasn't the thing that fills me up with energy and excitement and purpose. It was the relationships throughout that kept me going. And I think that's great in its own way. But for me, it was getting to a point where I had a little bit of an existential identity crisis. And what do I even like? I was like, I know I don't want to do this, but I don't know what I do want to do. And so I just went on a sabbatical for 7 months and traveled and did nothing that was related to moving forward in a goal. For the first time in my life, I was just being, and it was so interesting to hear people reflect back to me what they saw in me that I did really well, that I was like, nobody would pay for that. Everybody does that really well. And they're like, no, that's not true. So that was a big part of my aha moment around my unique talents and the way that I operate and the value that brings to the world, the things that are easy for me and effortless for me that other people really value and benefit from. And I built my business around that and then helping others do that too. So we can talk about what does it mean to define a personal brand, to cultivate your own brand, and what are some ways that people listening can do it?
I love that story. I think that's so interesting. And I also really just want to reflect on something you just said there about this idea of having the wisdom to be able to reflect on things that come easy for you, things that you naturally are doing in all different facets of your life, but also then through input maybe from others or just through some introspection to be able to connect even deeper to which of those things add a lot of value for others. That's really, this isn't rocket science, right? That's at the core of this, is being able to identify both sets of information and lean all the way into that. So I just really wanted to reflect because it made me think I need to write that down. I love that idea of the things that come easily for me. And also anytime I'm working with someone on a personal brand, or even I was at a birthday party with some friends the other day, and someone asked me to describe the personal brand work that I do. And I was just talking a little bit more about methodology. And they were all like, I feel like that's just what you do all the time. And I'm like, yes, that's why exactly. I do this for work, right? This is naturally, when I go to a party, I like corner people and I'm like, where did you go to college? Why did you go to college there? What did you do after that? And I want to know people's stories. And I have to imagine you're a little bit the same, because you strike me as someone who just wants to understand why people are the way that they are, and then to say it back to them, right? That's just so exactly. I just love that. I love that point.
I want to pause here for a second, because this might be the most important thing you can do in establishing your personal brand. And it can be the hardest. When we can name our innate talents, the things that we do effortlessly well, we can more easily recognize when work is a good fit for us. These are often things that you just do in your personal life or outside of work that you could actually reapply more often at work. Kat mentioned her example of asking really great personal reflective questions out of natural curiosity, even sometimes on the weekends at a party. And now she uses that talent in her branding work. For me, one of the things that people called out to me was my ability to manage lots of details when planning an experience for others, both logistical details and kind of individual preferences and needs, to ensure a really seamless, high-quality experience for everybody involved. I had no idea that was something that was unique to me, and that others on this trip to Bali had really highly valued that thing. And this was always just something that I did, right? And I did it really easily. And through others, I was able to discover it's actually a really valuable talent that I have. And now I use it when I'm designing and facilitating experiences for teams, like offsite meetings or workshops. So we'll bring this theme back throughout the rest of the episode also, but I want you to take a moment just to consider that there are talents you have that you may not even notice because they come so naturally to you. And give yourself some time and space to reflect on what those might be for you.
So in terms of how people can build a personal brand, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many people talking about this topic right now, and there's so many different approaches out there. The approach I tend to take, and one reason I think you and I connect and we love talking to each other, is I go pretty deep, because I find that there is nothing more terrifying or overwhelming, or honestly, that can turn you off more when you're having a hard time, when you feel stuck, to use a term you were using earlier, and unsure, or like you're facing a mounting identity crisis, than to try and look a question like, what do you want? Right in the eye. That's so hard to answer that question. I don't know what I want. What do I want? That feels so massive. I always joke, my husband's great at that question. You could be like, Nick, what do you want? And he'll be like, I'd like to buy 4 more pairs of skis. I want 2 powder skis. He always has a quick answer for that. But for me, I'm like, it's very existential. And what do you want to stand for? How do you want to be known? These are massive questions. So the approach I take, and where I know my work overlaps with yours, is to go back and say, maybe we don't try to go straight at that question. Maybe we take it back a little bit and just turn this into a practice, recognizing that a lot of us don't have a lot of good muscle memory right now for thinking about who we are and what we want. And so we have to go back to what we do know is true, and stop looking in all the wrong places to define ourselves. Stop looking to the left and the right, above or externally, and start looking internally and backwards. So my approach, I have kind of 3 sources of data that I look for. Much if I were doing a corporate brand, when I'm doing a personal brand, the data sources are going to be, one, just looking chronologically at the story. And I like to interview people and ask them about where their story begins. But what's interesting is that a lot of executives gloss right over. And I'm always pulling them back and saying, but wait a second, why did you guys live in Pittsburgh? How did you come to be there? What was the psychology of the family that you were born into? And how did or didn't that support you as you started to define what your life was going to be able to be? Like, who gave you permission to go pursue the things you decided to pursue? And what was it in you that helped drive decisions that you made earlier in your life? I'm always interested in when you were 10 years old, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up? And why was that interesting to you then? I hear from a lot of people from different kinds of backgrounds that they found themselves at an early age wanting to be a lawyer, a doctor, or to go into finance because they grew up in maybe a financially insecure family where the most important thing they could think is to pursue security. And that's just an insight. There's no judgment of that insight so much as just the benefit of the time spent thinking and talking out loud about these things. And the ahas tend to happen in the course of the dialogue. So much like in any kind of coaching, right? Like the conversations you have with someone and the things that you can extract from them. And as I'm listening to someone tell me their whole life story from where they were born, where their life began, what their early years were like, I'm always interested in whether you went to college, how you chose which college to go to, which college maybe you almost went to, and why didn't you go there? What degree did you think you would get versus which one did you ultimately get? What were some of the things that maybe changed your trajectory expectedly or unexpectedly? And how did you go through those things? When you start to dig into those deeply, and then you go into some specifics about your craft, about your work, about when you were working at a large corporate company or when you were out on your own, how do you approach the work that you do? What are some of the patterns that emerge in the value you create naturally? Maybe the things that you find easy that you do, even if no one asks you to do them, but that people around you are always reflecting as really beneficial to you. So there's this chronological piece where you're looking for patterns and trends along the way. And that's what makes it much less scary to attack the big questions, because you're looking at how the person you've always been evolves and changes and expresses itself throughout your life. That's where you're going to really get that self-knowledge and that information that starts to translate into the value you're able to add that's so unique to you, instead of trying to be somebody else, which a lot of us spend a lot of time doing. So the chronology is important. And then the next piece of data is the opposite. Because we spend so much time telling things chronologically, sometimes we overlook our best anecdotes are wedged in weird places in our subconscious. And so I spent a lot of time asking some of these thought starters, much like the coach asked me about your best day at work, your proudest accomplishments, what did it take to accomplish those things? And it bubbles up other questions and other thoughts you might not have seen directly. And then the third piece of data, which you had mentioned a little bit earlier, is the value of asking other people for input. Because to a person, I have to imagine you see this in your work, other people are far more generous describing us than we are. And it's always fun to marry up insights about what it feels like to work with me, how you might describe my superpower. And my favorite question to have my clients ask their champions is, what do you wish I celebrated more about myself? Because there's always something, to your point about things that come naturally to us, that we overlook because it's just natural. And we have an inherent bias that we don't realize that's so valuable because it's not natural to other people. And that's where the most authentic and important strengths are to lean all the way into. So gathering all of those pieces, that's the discovery process. And then the framework that I use to distill a personal brand is very much like a brand identity framework if you're branding a company or even a product, but it digs into components. You have to have a clear objective. What is my brand helping me achieve? An objective might be, I need to explore and articulate my value so I can do a better job exploring where I want to go next. Or I'd like my brand to help set me up to be the lead contender for a promotion. Or I'd like my brand to help me build visibility, awareness, and trust with potential clients as I launch my own consultancy. But knowing what the brand needs to help you achieve, like any strategy, is really core to success. Yeah. And then we build out your value proposition, which is very much grounded in a lot of stuff that you can see throughout your career, that distinct impact you can make. And trying to do that without jargon is always important. Something that feels accessible and sounds human. And then defining your persona, which is the X factor. That's what sets you apart. Harnessing and owning how to describe what you're like and what it feels like to be around you when you're doing that thing that you do so well, and your purpose, which is ultimately what drives you. So if you think about the brands that are popular, even consumer brands that people trust the most, you think about Patagonia comes up a lot. And when I ask people why they like Patagonia, why it makes them feel good to be associated with Patagonia or to support them, a lot of times it's because they feel that they know what's driving Patagonia. They can trust them. You have a sense of purpose from them. This is where I think purpose is helpful. And so as a person, being able to understand what ultimately is meaningful to you is going to make me feel more connected to you. It's going to make me understand how to be helpful to you as a supporter. It's going to make sure that I'm not making too many assumptions if I want to send work your way or a referral, because I've got a sense of what matters most to you, that kind of animating force. So there's the pieces of discovery, the information you need, the process that's so helpful, and then the distillation into these different buckets are the two major components to building a personal brand as I approach it.
I am curious on your thoughts on why do you suppose that most of the people when you start out don't want to go back into their past, into their history, into their childhood or their family life?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Oh, I have some.
I think, part of it is probably everything we were talking about earlier, that we don't necessarily live in and work in a world right now where we are encouraged to spend a lot of time there. I do tend to work with a lot of women who come from different disenfranchised or historically disenfranchised populations, or maybe from a lot of trauma and difficulty in their background. A lot of today's best leaders, I think, have overcome a lot of adversity. And a constant refrain is, I got here in spite of what I've faced, not because of it. And so I don't want to build my whole identity on that. I think there's also fear that you're going to be using trauma in a way that's almost like to make people feel bad for you. And so I think people are very cagey about how much of that truly personal stuff they bring forward. And I spend a lot of time trying to help them explore different ways that you can bring it forward so that it's not uncomfortable or unnecessarily revealing or striking the wrong tone, so much as recognizing that, to a point you said earlier, some of the most interesting origin stories or entrepreneur stories we hear are the ones where we're connecting to something we've been through ourselves. That's a big part of building trust and helping. We tend to focus in corporate America on intellectual skill sets and like proof points that we've earned our expertise, but a lot of our expertise is also in our lived experience. And so what I do tend to do is spend a lot of time talking about, I worked with a woman who was a Serbian war refugee, and she didn't want to necessarily lead with that banner because she felt like it almost might be a little bit off-putting to people. But what I did help her see is she had this beautiful language to talk about. She works in operations. She works in very hard skills, so to speak, parts of a very large real estate company. And it's very male dominated. And her style is very different. She has a lot of joy that she brings to her work. She has a lot of people focus. And so what we did start to talk about is, because of where she comes from, because of the things she's seen, because of what she's experienced, she has a very keen appreciation for the strength of the human spirit. And that very authentically is what shapes how she approaches her work, no matter which role she ended up in. I have a feeling that's what her style would be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And helping her see that there's value in just owning and knowing that about her, because there's few things more appealing, in my view, than being around somebody who really has done the work and knows themselves and can explain it to you. It's fascinating and it's comforting because you get the sense that this person is stable and they know who they are and why. So trying to help offset maybe that aversion that's inherent to, I don't want to go back to where I come from. Some of the people I work with, and I say, where does your story begin? And they'll be like, oh, my last job, I had this job title. And you really have to push through that to build the context to understand somebody.
Yeah, I definitely think there are some, and I think it's largely protective in a way. There are varying degrees to which you would want to, like, quote unquote, bring yourself to work in terms of how much, right, do we want to mask? How much do we want to leave things at the door or just not even share them with people? I think there's the Gallup survey on engagement. There's 12 questions, and one of them is, I have a best friend at work. And that culturally always shows that non-white people often score that much lower because they don't want a best friend at work. they want to come to work and do their job and go home and have their life outside of work. And so there is more compartmentalization. I think some of it is cultural and some of it's just a personal preference. So then when you sit down with someone in the context of work and ask them about their history, about their childhood, about all these things, I think you mentioned it's people don't want to exploit those things as a part of their brand, their quote unquote brand, because it feels gross in whatever way. But also protecting that part of themselves because they've really had to overcome a lot of adversity around it or things like that. And there's also just this element of work is work and I'm going to leave home at home, right? And that sense of like, why do we need to go into my childhood in order to do that? And so I think there's a difference between in the way that you do it of let's go back and mine this whole story so that it can contribute to the words that we align on versus you're going to tell every one of these stories to your team. And so I think there's a way that, it sounds like you're holding both of those things in a way that just feels safe for the people that you're working with and also still informs the process. So I often have childhood come up with when the coaching I do too, because it is so important.
It shapes our worldview. And I think even in doing the work, again, separate the outcome from the process that gets you there and the self-awareness from what you choose to say. They're not one and the same. So being willing to go back, being willing to open that up in a safe conversation, and then understanding how you possess that knowledge of I am this way because of these facts about my experience and because this evidence of how I've always moved through the world. And you don't have to go into the specifics necessarily, but when we think then about how does this actually express itself, one of the biggest questions I get is, okay, so I do this work, I do all the self-work, I build my self-awareness, I understand what drives me and why I am the way I am, what my strongest value is. I develop the language and the words to talk about it. What do I do with it? And I think a big part of this is circumstantial of being known and being knowable. So that is not the same as putting everything that's vulnerable or scary for you to share on full display. And I wish there was a way, if I had a silver bullet, to dismiss those two things being so intertwined. Because to me, what it means is having the self-awareness that for example, I'll just use me as an example again. I know when I was in a management role, I tended to be so impatient. My bias towards action added a lot of value for me and a lot of others because I got things done, but I also could steamroll people. And I realized over time, as I became more senior, I speak really fast. I get very excited about ideas. I'm pretty intellectual when I connect with ideas. And I didn't leave a lot of room for people to feel like they could ask for clarification if they weren't tracking with me. And I would leave people behind. And so what I had to start to do, because I didn't necessarily think that I could change that about me, and in some ways I didn't want to change what I knew also made me effective. But what it did mean is I could sit down with people and say, I am aware that in my enthusiasm for forward progress, I can sometimes make it feel like there's no room to jump in, or I can leave people behind. And if you feel that way, please know, even if it feels like we're moving fast in the moment, I'm always open to conversation. Please raise a flag, or maybe I will make sure we have extra check-ins to make sure everyone feels good, because I was often not leaving room to check in with people and make sure that people were coming along with me on the journey. So having the awareness, sharing it with your team is a really great example, in my view, of where this stuff does belong. It doesn't mean I need to unpack why I have a bias for action. I've been through a lot of therapy and I actually really have a lot of answers for that question, but they probably don't all belong in the workplace, to your point. But the fact that I have that insight about myself and I can share it with other people in a way that's makes me more user-friendly.
Yes.
I would imagine is very similar to the work you're doing when we talk about showing up authentically at work. Doesn't mean showing up and making my baggage everybody's problem.
Yes, totally. And again, it comes back to language. Can I articulate that I move quickly, and sometimes that doesn't match up with my internal intentions, and I'm going to now verbally make the space for you to bring your ideas. It's so similar to a story I just shared in an episode. So I'm like, yep, I hear you. I get you on that. Yeah, totally. So Kat shared her process here. First, going backwards in time and knowing where you came from and what led you to where you are today. And then going inward and reflecting on your work, your craft, or insights from prompts like sharing about your best day at work. And lastly, hearing from others about what they see in you. And then she distills it down into kind of these three parts: your value proposition, the impact you make, your persona, this X factor that you have, and your purpose. So, what gives you a sense of purpose? When I do this work, it's typically for clients who want to grow into the next phase of their leadership, or maybe they want to find more fulfillment in their career. Maybe they're making a career transition or want to, or they're working on a specific kind of well-being challenge, like I'm having a hard time with boundaries at work, or overworking or stressing myself out in a certain way. And I use the Enneagram framework to help my clients better understand those talents that they have innately and the patterns that keep them from showing up fully or might cause us to have those well-being challenges. And we do work to articulate their values, to really understand deeply what are the conditions that enable them to thrive in their work life, and learning how to advocate for those things confidently, to ask for what you need in the context of your workplace. In either case, you come out of this work having this much clearer idea of who you are uniquely in this world. Going from saying something like, oh, I'm an empathetic leader, or I'm great at leveraging data to find new insights, to something that is so much more specific to you, something that no one else at the table could say the same thing. And that, my friends, is a personal brand. Can you articulate the unique value that you bring into every room just by being you? So the next part of this, and Kat just teed this up, is how do you use this insight and awareness? What do you go do with your personal brand? And I think about it like having core values. You can have 3 to 5 words on a piece of paper and you can say, I know my core values, but what are you doing with those words? Are you really living them? Are you using them as a filter when you have tough decisions to make in your life? The same thing really goes with personal branding. Having the words on paper is just really the first step. And now you go and do something with that knowledge. So in this next part, we're going to talk a bit more about some of the specific tools or prompts that you can use. And then we're going to get into how do you utilize your personal brand. And I will talk more about some of these specifics in the wrap up.
It's funny to me that one response I get from a lot of my personal branding clients when I help them with the language to talk about who they are, or their style or their persona, is people think that having a disjointed brand or being both this and that is a problem. But I think many brand strategists will tell you that tensions or creative tensions in an identity are very interesting, very compelling, and what make people more unique. One of my biggest beefs with corporate America, in addition to everything we've already covered here, is that I think because of all of these dynamics we've discussed, we've become really uncreative in the lexicon and terminology we use in the corporate world. We grab hold of jargon because then we sound like everyone else. Like we truly, another example of conformity. And it doesn't even mean you need impressive sounding language, but there's so many more interesting ways to talk about things. And one reason that I do my work the way I do is so that I can hear people's voices. I write down everything they say, and I stitch together things that they said naturally to help them speak in their own voice, which is so much easier said than done. And I was just working with a client who's a chief people officer. She worked with some national nonprofit organizations, working for a startup now. And as we were talking, she said something that I just really struck me. She, in 2 different sentences, she said, I'm fiercely independent. Again, also very much shaped by where she comes from. But also she said that she's always looked out for others. She looks after people. And so her persona statement starts with, I'm fiercely independent and I look after everyone. And her reaction was, can I say both of those things? And I said, yes, because you can be both of those things. We're all complex people. And it's so much more interesting when we allow ourselves to own that. You can be quiet and expressive. You can be dynamic and you can be steady. All of these things can live in one person. And in many cases, the whole point is not to box ourselves into one phrase or one term, and instead to be the rich flavor of all of those different things. If you find yourself bridging 2 different seemingly opposite facts or strengths or tendencies, lean into it, not away from it.
play in that space
Yeah.
versus I think, yeah, oftentimes I need to distill it down to one bullet point that only says one thing very clearly, right? That we're also trained to think that way in our work in the corporate space. So I want to talk about some tools because you mentioned a lot about kind of the framework that you go through. One of the things that I really love to use, I guess, too, is assessments help in a way. You mentioned strengths finders. It's like
Yeah.
having something that helps give us some new language, some different terminology, or even just the awareness of, oh, I do that, or oh, I am an activator. I never really thought about that, but yeah, I'm like the hype woman, or I find
Yeah.
the fun in the things, or whatever. So I think assessments help us with language when we maybe can't come up with it ourselves. And I know you use a lot of kind of writing prompts or conversation
Yeah.
around that to get that language out, sounds.
Yeah, and I think you can do that in multiple ways. You can do it in group settings where one of the biggest issues or roadblocks I see for this work is people will intend to do it, they want to do it, but none of us really has time unless you really want to carve it out and make it a priority. And so I find like the boot camp model has been successful for me, mostly simply because there's accountability. It's much like committing to a coaching project or a coaching relationship where you set aside the time in your day and in your schedule, and then you sit down and you move from writing prompt to language and discovery through the process. And one of the reasons I think I love writing prompts so much is people make this stuff so much more complicated than it has to be. And if there was one way to frame my objective and mission when it comes to personal brand work, it's that I want to remove all of the barriers standing in the way of people spending more time getting to know themselves and finding the words for it. And so I am a huge fan of recommending that you spend a half hour, maybe once a week for a series of weeks at your best, not something shoveled in between your 2:00 and your 3:00 call that you just happen to have an open half hour. But you reserve, for me, it's always the first hour of my workday. Wherever I direct that hour reflects what's most important to me. Giving the first hour over to yourself and then making it so it's easy once you do sit down to know what to do. And so that's where I think the writing prompts of just setting out to say, okay, I'm going to work on these 2 questions, and you just write freely. And you have to trust and believe. And you will see rather quickly, for anyone who's done free writing on a regular basis, especially I would say for those of us who don't think we're writers with a capital W.
Raising my hand over here. Yeah.
Really? That's funny.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
People like bringing yourself back to the page, so to speak, especially when you use pen and paper. It's such an important kind of psychological experience to bring yourself back to you, to feel centered with you. I remember right when I left my old job, I was doing some pre-work for Indie Collective. And I was so excited to do the mastermind that you and I both actually met through. And one of the questions was something like, name 5 people you admire and why. And I will never forget the sense of crisis that I had because I could only come up with one.
Yeah.
And I did another writing prompt that was name 3 things you've achieved and how you did it and why you were proud of them, and 3 big achievements that you have never gone after and what's stopping you. And I couldn't even think of 3 things I wanted to achieve. And that was how disconnected I had gotten from actually just listening to myself. And so it's so much more in just the sitting and the doing. Something interesting comes out and it makes the writing prompt almost the easiest part. You just need to find some good ones. So for anyone who's trying to look for a writing prompt, like some great ways to give yourself some parameters is I'm a fan of number 1, number 3, and number 5. So what is the number 1 thing I wish people better understood about me? Or what are 3 things I have learned about what I do, fill in the blank, that other people might not know? Or what are the top 5 ways to be successful in this thing that I have done? The wisdom exists in us, but pulling lived wisdom out of you and giving it voice is why even conversations like this are so valuable, because some of us need to hear ourselves talk or see ourselves write in order to get that wisdom out. And I would argue it's incumbent on us to share that wisdom, especially if we've faced adversity, or especially if we want to see other people succeed. And that's part of our purpose, because how are people going to follow in your footsteps, or how are people going to benefit from all the things you've achieved if you don't pause, take the time to reflect on what you've learned and extract the language from your own mind and then share it with other people? that's really what a lot of us, I think I know you and I are always working at, is your voice is a form of service. And sharing that with other people is one of the most important things you can do when you think about just using your time well here, right?
Yeah, I love that. And the idea about we just don't take the time to listen to ourselves. I've done morning pages before. I think you were making a nod to that
Yeah.
in terms of just having some kind of writing practice, whether it's free writing or prompts, I think is so helpful. And having conversations with a coach, with whoever, right? And in the work that we do, I think there's just a lot of stuff naturally that comes up that when we give ourselves the opportunity to dig into those questions or just to reflect on things that we maybe don't do in our day to day, it's incredibly helpful. Another thing that we talked about before was having things reflected back to you by the people that either know you really well or don't know you at all, but just have experienced you for a short period of time, which is what I had happen when I was traveling. And I came back, and actually in my master's program, we did an exercise called the Reflected Best Self, where we had people share stories of us at our best. And it's something that I do regularly now with clients. Give me 3 stories about Cat when Cat was at her best. What was the context? Tell me the story. And then we'll go and mine it for themes. And I did this as a part of my master's program, and I fell in love with this exercise because one of the things, and I will never forget this, one of the things that somebody said in one of their stories is, when I'm in the room, they learn more about themselves and each other.
I love that.
And I was like,
yeah,
I never ever would have thought of that. Right now, it's so much of what I do, right? With the podcast, with coaching, with teams, and having conversations, and using my curiosity, like you mentioned, to just ask more questions about stuff I'm wondering about. And then other people get to hear them articulate things. And so it's really cool to get that insight from people and how they see you and the things that you just never maybe would have articulated on your own.
I love that so much. And I think one of the things that is so important to me about this work, your work, my work, where it all overlaps, one of the reasons I get so upset that personal branding is so easy. On the one hand, as you said earlier, it's a trendy topic. It's a hot topic. People feel like, oh, I should probably pay attention to this. I get a lot of shoulds from people when I start working with them of like, I should probably do this, but I'm afraid to do this, or I don't want to do this. And I hate that because there's so much that's real and life-changing in that discovery that comes from simply committing to doing the work and giving yourself this gift of getting feedback from people. I absolutely love that writing prompt. I'm going to start using that. So thank you. And I also think all the time about the kindness and generosity other people give to me, or that we can give to others when we pause and reflect, whether it's somebody you just met at some kind of leadership seminar. I remember one of the most impactful pieces of feedback I got was from someone I met at a Wharton event. And at the end of the week, he told me about like his evolving perception of me over the course of the week. And nobody had ever helped me see what my first impressions really were and the strength in them, because we get so surrounded by people who know us so well that we don't tend to think to keep our network wide and open and ask other people for that kind of feedback. And it's a real gift to us and also to other people. That's what it all comes down to, right? Totally. That's what's so important about it.
And that's great segue, because it's okay. What do we do with this information once we have it? Why do I want to go do this? And I love what you said about being known and being knowable is one way we can action this personal brand. And I think others are, how do we use our talents and our natural ways of being and all the things that are amazing about us to help other people, to build our mission in the world, to connect with people and bring things out of them. And so I think that's really beautiful. And then other ways, I think it's in a lot of the work that I do, it's helping name what are the conditions that enable me to do my best work.
Yeah.
Being able to advocate for yourself with your manager, your leadership, or whatever, to say, hey, I can do this if you'll allow me these resources, or this time or space, or this process, and how I'm allowed to go away and do this work in my own way. And, oh, by the way, this benefits the company hugely. And so being able to just articulate those things about yourself are part of the benefit of doing this work, and kind of, whether we call it personal brand or just knowing yourself, it's really one and the same.
I think it falls into the category of helping others help you. and being self-aware and knowing how to talk about the highest and best use of your time and share that as you self-advocate with your boss, and say, if you're going to have me do one thing, have it be this. But I also see it, if we've all been on the receiving end of maybe a networking email or somebody who's looking for a job, there's a lot of that going on right now. And it's very stressful when you get an email request from somebody and they need your help, but they don't really know what they're looking for. It makes it really hard to help them. It puts you almost on the defensive because you're like, I don't have the time to figure out what to do for you. We have to put in the work ourselves to figure out what we want through everything you and I've been talking about today. Once we distill it into very short, clear bullets or sentences or phrases, it makes it so much easier, to your point, whether you're talking to someone internal, someone outside of your company, or just somebody who maybe has a chance to connect you to opportunities you're excited about. If we are very clear and concise about that, it makes it so much easier to ask the world to rally around us and help us make that a reality. So it's both in the insight of just having spent the time to define it, not easy, but possible through everything we've discussed, and in the language to distill it and describe it and articulate it in a really simple way. We get more of what we want. We get more of what's important to us. We get more of what suits our value and strength. And it's hard not to think that there's going to just be so many different ripple effects of benefits when we're all really clued into that and much more concise in asking for what we want and what we need.
Yeah, amazing. I think that's a great place for up to.
That feels like a good note to end on.
Yeah. It's like the benefits to us and the benefits to everybody else, and allowing people in enough that they can help us accomplish those things, because clearly we can all achieve more together than we can by ourselves. So language matters, and I love the work that you're doing, and just even more so than we even thought how similar our work is and how we're
so fun. I know. Yeah,
there's things in the same direction.
Only makes me think of 10 more questions I would love to ask you another time.
We'll do that off the podcast.
Yes, offline. Thanks for giving me a chance to chat about this with you, and for seeing the value in what I do. It's so much fun to get to connect with other people who are out there fighting the good fight. Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, so we covered a lot. Let's recap a little bit. In the first half, we talked a lot about the dynamics that we're all dealing with in the workplace and why it's hard to be authentic at work because of them. And the rest of the episode was really all about creating and cultivating your personal brand and then understanding what to do with that clarity. So in step 1, in defining your personal brand, it's really all about what's the unique value that you bring into every room just by being you. Or how do you define your personal brand through those 3 things that Kat mentioned: your value proposition, your persona, and your purpose. I'll link a couple of resources for this. Kat's blog has a lot of great thought prompts and easy to digest articles to help you explore different areas of this framework. If you're interested in some deeper self-discovery using an assessment or a different kind of framework, I really do love Strengths Finders. That's the one that Kat mentioned. It's now called Clifton Strengths. And of course, I also really love the Enneagram. And I just released 2 episodes on the Enneagram, episode 20 and 21. And so this is a 2-part series to get you really grounded in how do you uncover your type and what do you do next once you found it. I'll also link an exercise called the RBSE. So it's the Reflected Best Self exercise. And it's very simple. You can do it through the system that I'll link in here, or you can just email the people closest to you. And it asks those in your world to share stories about you at your best. And I mentioned that I used this during the episode, and it's a pretty beautiful experience to hear how others view and value you. I used it in my grad school program, and now I use it a lot with my clients. And then part 2 of this is really, okay, now once you have some clarity, what do you go do? And it's important to do something with this information, with this personal brand or this internal exploration that you've done. It's the difference between having your core values written on a piece of paper and actually living them. So how will you use this understanding of yourself to make choices, to say yes to opportunities that feel really aligned with who you are, or to say no to things that don't enable you to do work in the way that you best operate? More of what you're great at and less of what drains you or exhausts you. That's really the name of the game here. You can share this information with others to help them understand you as well. I love what Kat said about being known and being knowable. You can use your knowledge of what you do best to make decisions about where to focus your energy or where to delegate or eliminate work. Or you can have language to share with other people about how they can best work with and collaborate with you. Or those places where sometimes your impact doesn't always match your intention, like Kat's example of she often moves really quickly and gets excited about ideas and has this bias for action. But what can happen is that sometimes that might steamroll others' opinions and ideas. And so knowing this about herself, she can share it with others to say, my intent is to be collaborative and to hear your ideas. If I start moving too fast, please call me out, remind me. And this isn't to give ourselves an excuse not to change, but it's really about being able to communicate your intentions and create space for other people to dive in with you, because we're human and we can't always be perfect. So the more that we can verbalize these internal things about ourselves, the easier it is for us to collaborate with people. So you can also use this kind of personal brand or this internal knowledge about who you inherently are to stay grounded in moments that you might feel influenced or pushed to be something else. Like when you're asked to do things in a specific way that's not aligned with how you work best, or you're told that you have to take on a certain persona in order to get promoted, and you know that's not you. The thing is, when we're clear on our value, we can advocate for ourselves and say, no, I actually want to approach this project or this presentation in my way, in a different way. And the benefit of that is actually a better business result or maybe a better utilization of resources. So we can also use this information to know when a job is right for us. I had a client recently that was a marketing executive and an incredible relationship builder. And there's so much more detail in her approach to work that we really uncovered throughout our work together. But if she's looking for opportunities in the future and there's a company who needs someone to build a brand through data mining, and there's a different company who needs someone to build a brand through partnerships, what kind of clarity will she now have about the right opportunity for her? One really will leverage that amazing relationship building talent that she had, and one might not do that as much. And so when we can own this information, we can use it to make better decisions for us. Understanding yourself and having clarity on who you are, having this kind of strong personal brand, they're really all in the same bucket. It's about how can we be more successful in our careers with less sacrifice and struggle. I love this quote I found years ago that success is not about how productive you are. It's about how well aimed your productivity is. Ultimately, the more we can really understand and embrace the unique value that we inherently have, the better we can channel it towards the outcomes that matter most to us.